This week's readings, chapter 3 and chapter 5, talk about slavery and their discontents. And we see in chapter 3 where Irish and black slaves come together to rebel against their condition. We see in chapter 5 the various forms of African American slaves' revolts, an uprising, whether it be physical uprising or an uprising of the mind. And I want to highlight a few individuals that were what I call notables. You're going to notice that throughout this course there are what I call unknown notables, and these are important figures, important minority figures in history that have contributed greatly, but yet are not well celebrated in our U.S. history courses. One of them being Martin Delany, and you will notice the slides on Delany in week 2's lecture slides. But I want to point out a couple of more, notables that I want you to be aware of. One of them is this gentleman by the name of Olaudah Equiano. Equiano was born in 1745 in Igbo, which is now Nigeria. When he was about 11, Equiano was kidnapped and sold to slave traders that were headed to the West Indies. Though he spent a brief period in the state of Virginia, much of Equiano's time in slavery was spent serving the captains of the slave ships and the British Navy vessels. So Equiano traveled extensively all over Europe as a result of being the slave of these Navy vessels. And then in 1763, his fate changed. He was purchased by a Quaker merchant in Philadelphia by the name of Robert King. He became Robert King's clerk, and he worked on King's trading sloops where he was allowed to engage in his own minor trade exchanges. With the money that he saved up from his own small trades, he was able to save up enough money to eventually purchase his own freedom in 1766. This is at the very beginning of the slave trade when it was not 100% clear of what Americans were going to do with slaves. At this point, there were indentured servants as seen with Germans and Irish, and so at first, African slaves were no different. They would eventually work off their passage or pay for their freedom and be able to live as free individuals. And that was the case with Equiano. When he purchased his freedom, he decided to move to England, and he enrolled himself in a university, and he became the apprentice of a scientist. Then in 1789, he wrote and published his own autobiography. It was called The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Augustus Vasa, which was also his name, written by himself, volume 1. This was a 2-volume work. It's important for you to notice that he took the extra effort to write written by himself. It was very important for Equiano to make it known that not only was he an African that was worthy of his story being told, but he was an African who, while a slave, lived a very interesting life, a life that other people would want to read about. And not only was this book interesting and real and true, he wrote it himself. So this was an expression, a political revolt, if you will, to show his oppressors that I'm not only an educated man now, but I write a book that is interesting about my life, and it becomes a bestseller, if you will. It is widely read throughout England and America. In fact, some scholars believe that some of these accounts that he gave in his narrative about the conditions of the slave trade, the atrocities that were going on these slave ships, this inhumane condition, he explains them with such great detail that it really is one of the first times that scholars believe that we get a real picture of how these ships were and what the conditions were on these slave ships. Equiano had a project to dispel the myth entirely that Africans were inferior, racially inferior, and that they were not the full human as whites were. The next gentleman I want to talk about, the next lesser-known notable, is David Walker. He lived several years after Equiano. He was alive from 1785 to 1830. In 1828, Walker published a written pamphlet entitled Walker's Appeal. And in this pamphlet, he articulated his militant denunciation of slavery. He denounced those whites who held slaves and those blacks who assisted in the slavery of their fellow man. In his pamphlet, he used very strong language. He used Christian language, and he quoted scripture to assert that slavery was a sin, which was a very bold move for an African to do so, for an African American at this point to do so. He asserted that God would punish the nation for the sin of slavery. Furthermore, he used the Declaration of Independence, and he used the words of the Declaration of Independence as a reminder of how hypocritical, how contradictory the institution of slavery was against our own declaration. You can read here, and I won't read the whole thing, but he says, "See your declaration, Americans. Do you understand your own language? That there's just no way that they could coexist, both slavery and the pursuit of happiness and freedom." He reminds them that in our declaration, we believe that all men are created equal, and that that our liberties and our rights are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, among those life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so he really kind of throws it in the face of, he throws our own language, our own words against us, so that we would see how terrible slavery was. Now, in these pamphlets, they were both meant to be communicated to those who believed that slavery was a protected institution. He also wrote these to communicate with Southerners, both any abolition sympathizers, and to infuriate, to activate slaves to revolt, to make them see that they should not be okay or complacent, or should no longer accept their situation as slaves. Here we have two quotes where he's basically saying, "Kill or be killed." And this is a very dangerous thing to say. If he was to be caught by any Southerners encouraging their slaves to revolt, he could be killed. Of course, any slave that would be carrying this pamphlet would be punished or killed. So he had to be very careful how he distributed this pamphlet. Now, it is understood that David Walker lived in the North, was a free man, and was also a tailor. So what he would do is he would line the jackets of the suits that he was working on, and he would send them south with whomever purchased the jacket or whoever came in for alterations. And that person would then disseminate, pass out this information, the pamphlets, to clergy so that it could be read from the churches to various people in the South. And that is how David Walker made his information known. Now, I want to talk a little bit about where the country was in this time. We're talking about a time where slavery had been around for several years, several decades by then. And things were starting to get very nervous. There were words that there had been some revolts, some bloody revolts, as we saw with Nat Turner. In Haiti, there was a revolt on this French island. Haiti was a French island and was a high coffee and sugar plantation was the crop of Haiti. It was widely successful. And because of the nature of growing coffee and sugar, it required vast amounts of labor. And as a result, the slave population far outnumbered the French by terrifying amounts. And because of their population, and because of their ability to come together culturally and to communicate, the slaves came together, organized a revolt, and essentially killed off all the French and Spanish slave owners that were on the island. It came to the point where if any French or Spanish was not dead, they were fleeing, and they were on a boat on their way out of Haiti and hopefully to the next possible land that they could get to safely. So here we have the Haitians revolt. They take Haiti, and they establish their own government. Haiti declared itself a republic. It was only the second independent state of the Western Hemisphere. They defined themselves as Black and as Haitians, no longer as Africans or as slaves, but as Black men and women and people of Haiti. They were the first nation to call themselves a Black nation. So naturally, American slave owners were very fearful of this, having heard of the possibility of Black slaves coming together to kill the owners. As you could imagine, the slave owners were very nervous for their own lives. At this point in 1860, there were 4 million Blacks, and they were all slaves, certainly in the South. 35% of the total population were Black slaves. They were physically stronger. There were more of them. They were angry enough to destroy them. So in order to keep slaves under control, they utilized psychological tactics as well as physical ones, of course. But as they continued to physically abuse African slaves for so many years, that became somewhat par for the course. So slave owners had to come up with new ways of subjecting slaves and subduing them. Now, almost 200 years into the slavery, there was a different type of slave. There were slaves that really didn't know much more other than their enslavement. They were born into slavery. There was also at this time, there was great criticism of slavery in America. Most of Europe had already abolished slavery, so there was pressure for Americans to abolish slavery. But obviously, slave owners did not want to get rid of this institution, so they would do things to convince themselves and to convince the slaves themselves that they were this happy situation, and they created this persona of the happy slave. Now, the happy slave was